kids are always...
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're going to get started. My name is Susan Lamb, and I'm an MPA student here at the Kennedy School and a member of the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Caucus. I am delighted to have this opportunity to introduce our three guests who will be discussing gay rights, civil rights, the common struggle, a subject close to the hearts of many of us. We are here tonight, a diverse group of people with similar interests and dreams. Ones that include living in a world that protects our basic civil liberties. We have so often been told by those who persecute and condemn us that what we are asking for are actually special rights, not the same rights afforded them. So tonight, we want our discussion to draw on the commonalities amongst our movement to confirm, based on the lessons of those who have gone before, that indeed it is one civil rights movement that we are speaking of. I think you will agree we are making progress, but how long will it take? Martin Luther King responded, "However difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth, pressed to the earth, will rise again." How long? Not long, because the arm of the moral universe is long, but the trend is towards justice. It is essential we work together to build strong and binding unions, because I do believe the trend is towards justice, and if we work hard, the arm of the moral universe will reach justice sooner, and the truth pressed to the earth will rise again more quickly. With us this evening, leading our discussion, is a man who defies stereotypes. The Reverend Peter Gomes is a Baptist preacher, the author of the Good Book, chaplain of Memorial Church at Harvard University, and has been at the college for more than 25 years. He is the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals at Harvard Divinity School, an advocate of civil rights and other social issues, as well as an advocate of the lessons from the Bible. Reverend Gomes is an African-American Republican who speaks his mind with unabashed originality and authenticity. Need I say more? Thank you for joining us. We are also privileged to have the president of the National Organization for Women, Patricia Ireland. Patricia has committed herself to defending women's rights to choose, electing a record number of women to public office, working more closely in coalitions with other social justice and civil rights groups, and is a champion of international feminist issues. Especially adept at challenging people to make the connections between women's rights and other human rights issues, she is the prime architect of NOW's Global Feminist Program, and has a new book out entitled What Women Want, and she'll be signing copies after this evening's program. Last week in Washington, D.C., NOW sponsored the Lesbian Rights Summit, which focused on developing political strategies, coalition building, and breaking through barriers that splinter our movement. I'm sorry I had to miss it, and welcome to you this evening.
Thank you.
Due to the courage of openly gay members presently serving in Congress and others who have served and retired, we are now seeing a first wave of gays and lesbians running as out candidates and winning. It is certainly a significant moment in gay rights history. No longer are we ostracized as a group on the fringe of American politics. We have rightfully earned a seat at the table thanks to elections such as Congresswoman Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin and our very own Massachusetts State Representative Jerriet Barrios. This gay Latino lawyer turned the political status quo in Cambridge on its head by crushing a 5-term incumbent and 2 other candidates in the Democratic primary, and then defeating his Republican opponent in the general election. He is the voice of a diverse constituency in the 28th Middlesex District. He is on the board of the Gay Lesbian Advocates and Defenders and founder of the Massachusetts House Latino Caucus. We are very proud to have him join us tonight. Please help me welcome all of our guests.
Well, my instructions tell me that I am to moderate these proceedings, which the first part of which should be relatively easy. Our two speakers each will have about 15 minutes in which to stand on whatever number of soapboxes they choose to use this evening, and then there will be a little bit of inter-panel exchange, I think they call it here in the Kennedy School, dialogue. And then the more difficult part of the proceedings will be that we then will open it up to you, all of whom have come with prepared speeches, which you already regard as superior to anything that we might have to offer up here. So we will try to not suck up all the air and allow these proceedings to move along. And there was some notion here of an adjournment by 9 o'clock, but I suspect if there's anything interesting going on, we will continue for a little while after that. And when it begins to turn tedious, repetitious, dull, and predictable, I will bring the proceedings to a close. The only, perhaps it's so common knowledge that it doesn't need to be said anymore, but perhaps the only omission to that otherwise accurate introduction about my good self is that I happen to be gay as well, which I suppose is a qualification for serving on this panel, but I don't think it's a disqualification. And so with that little footnote, I think we will proceed. I think it's exciting that this occasion has a figure of the national stature and visibility and reputation as well as accomplishments of Patricia Ireland. And I'm sure the Kennedy School is used to welcoming the great and the good, but I'm not always used to being in the company of the great and the good, so I'm just so flattered to be seated, as you notice, on your right hand at Dextra Majorum, and I look forward to your opening remarks. So our first speaker will be Patricia Ireland.
Thank you. Now, I can't help it. I have to untape this and move around, if that's all right with you, and I'll just drive the camera operator crazy. Well, I'm very glad to be here with you tonight. I see some folks that I know and some that I don't. What have I done? I've taped myself down again. There we go.
There we go.
Okay, now have I destroyed enough of the furniture? And all right. I've been the president of NOW since 1991, and when I became president, it was one of my goals to strengthen our ties within the women's movement across various lines that have historically separated us by class or race, ethnicity, and also to strengthen our ties across movement lines, because it seems to me that that's the only way we are a majority and can in fact accomplish the civil rights and the equality that we seek in these various movements. And so I started by joining the Rainbow Coalition. I now serve on the board of the Rainbow, and one of the very first things that I did, which I just loved it. I went down to the King Center for Martin Luther King's birthday celebration, and was seated in the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church. I felt so moved just to be in that church. And then Coretta Scott King, Mrs. King, was giving the speech that year. I had talked to some folks who work with and for her, and it's the first time I'd ever heard her speak, so I had no comparison, but they said it was one of the best speeches they'd ever heard her give. And I was very moved. I felt in some ways as if Reverend Martin Luther King were speaking directly to me through her message, because I had found myself very filled with hate and anger. I can remember looking across this Supreme Court plaza, waiting for one of the arguments, and seeing Randy Terry, and before I could even catch myself, just thinking
I hate him. And then realizing that I was giving him tremendous power and allowing him to control my being and fill me with this toxic emotion that turning me into a person I didn't want to be. And so I was listening very carefully to her message of nonviolence and of seeking the best part of every person and appealing to that better part of them and not giving up on anyone. Well, I have to say I'm still not real clear that Randy Terry is ever going to come around, but I was really touched and moved, and you can see from the photos of that day as we went out of Ebenezer Baptist Church and lined up to start the annual King Day March through Atlanta, how proud I am to be there and how excited, and it just shows all over my face. Here I am with Coretta Scott King and Andrew Young and Reverend Jesse Jackson and Bernice King, who's also Reverend King, and this whole, James Olmos is there, and I'm like, wow, this is really cool, because I'd just become president of NOW. I was not at all used to such things, and I thought, well, I have arrived, and so, you can just see how excited I am to be there. And then I got my comeuppance, or I got the lesson out of that day. The second lesson came many weeks later when someone sent me a clipping from some very small town in Pennsylvania, and they had a picture of the front line, and that's how I know how excited and filled I was with enthusiasm that day. I had the spirit. And the caption reads, "The annual King Day March, front line, Reverend Jesse Jackson, Ambassador Andrew Young, unidentified white woman, Coretta Scott King." I loved it. I mean, it really, just reminded me to be humble. It's so hard. Part of the reason that story came to mind, besides the fact that it showed my hubris and being brought down to earth, was that Mrs. Coretta Scott King that day in her speech in the church spoke of lesbian and gay civil rights and brought them into her purview as part of the civil rights movement and discussion. And as I gather, that was something that had been some time in coming. The people who work with her had been talking with her. One of the men who I know who works very closely with her is an openly gay man. And so they had had an ongoing dialogue, and she had come to the conclusion that this was part of the civil rights agenda, which again shows, I think, some of the progress that we've made. Well, I want to then come forward about 9 months after that or so, 1992, when it was the so-called Year of the Woman. Like, would be happy with 1 year and one woman, right? And how we celebrated. I mean, we had tripled the number of women in the Senate, which was ever so much more encouraging than saying we went from 2 to 6 out of 100. And we had doubled the number of women in Congress, and all the women in Congress, something like 30% or more were women of color. And we were kind of proud of that. The guys still had a long way to go to catch up with that proportion. So then we moved on after these women were sworn into the appointments process. And you will recall that President Clinton had pledged to name the first ever woman attorney general. Well, that was very special to me in particular, because when I went to law school there, I've outed myself as a lawyer. You said, by the way, when you were talking about him, it sounded awfully close to liar, and I'm sure that was just your accent. Did it sound that way to you? Yeah, I'm sure it was a Boston thing. I would stick with attorney in the future. Or representative. We'll just call you Representative Barrios. So when I was in law school, and someone would say to me, "What do you want to do when you get out of law school?" I would always say, "I want to be a Supreme Court justice." Now, I have no interest in a career on the bench. I mean, I have not got a judicial temperament, for one thing. But I liked watching their eyes roll around in their heads, because at that time there had never been a woman on the Supreme Court. and I just thought it was kind of a good consciousness raiser. There had never been a woman attorney general. As far as I could see when I was in law school, the top of my profession was closed to me. And so I was particularly interested among all the appointments that Clinton made and his pledge to make his cabinet look more like the country, that he had pledged to name a woman attorney general. You will recall the sequence. First we had Zoe Baird. And Zoe Baird actually got a hearing in front of the Senate Judiciary panel. I was talking back to the television the whole time because both sides of the aisle started quizzing her about who took care of her kids, who took care of her household. And I was sitting there steaming as I heard people like Joe Biden say, well, let's see, you leave before 8 o'clock in the morning, you don't come home until after 8 o'clock at night. When do you see your son? And I was like, if that were Joey Baird instead of Zoe Baird, you wouldn't even ask that question, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, as you know, what came out of that questioning was it came to light that she had hired undocumented workers as household help. And so they booted her out of the nomination. Come to find out, indeed, I was correct. If it had been Joey Baird, they wouldn't have thought of it. There were two guys already confirmed into the cabinet who indeed, as it turned out, had hired undocumented workers for their household help. They laid it off on their wives, bad judgment, and they stayed in the cabinet. And so he went back to the private sector. Next along comes Kimba Wood. Kimba Wood was gone so fast that most people hardly even noticed. She got no hearing. She had also hired undocumented workers. Now, mind you, it was at a time when it wasn't illegal, so I assumed she was supposed to use her women's intuition to understand they were going to make it illegal and comply in advance. But she was gone, and I started saying in all of my talks, if the president's going to name the first woman attorney general, it's going to have to be a childless woman with a dirty house. And along came Janet Reno. A childless woman and a self-confessed bad housekeeper, okay? Well, no sooner had all of the Washington wags breathed a sigh of relief that she was not going to have what had come to be known as the nanny gate problem, then the tongues started wagging again. Oh, a woman in her 50s, never been married, doesn't have kids, must be queer. Happened just that fast that the discussion moved from whether she was tough enough, whether she was a good enough politician, whether she was a strong enough lawyer to do the job, to who did she love. And I was really struck by that, in part because it's so common when women are assertive and ambitious and competent and confident. It's not a question, if you're a feminist activist, of whether you're going to be called a lesbian, but rather when. And so, you know, we all come up with our answers in advance if we're smart. And, you know, my favorite, of course, was Gloria Steinem years ago, when a reporter said to her, "Are you a lesbian?" She turned around and said, "Are you the alternative?" It was so good. I've been waiting to use that on Jerry Falwell. You know, I can hardly wait. But it occurred to me, of course, that is one of the ways that our movement is divided, and that the movements are divided from each other. It's used to separate women from each other. We're supposed to look at the lesbians and say, "Oh, you see, you're bringing us down," and you know, they're supposed to look at us and say, "Well, you see, you're selling us out," and we're not supposed to stand together and be strong, much less stand with gay men or bisexuals or transgendered, and certainly not with the civil rights movement. Everybody knows they're sexist. I mean, all of this goes around to try to keep us from standing together and being strong. Well, Janet Reno came up with an answer that was perfect for a politician. It was not the first time she had faced this question. And so she had this standard answer, which was, "I'm an awkward old maid with a great affection for men." It was perfect politically. It implied that she was heterosexual, great affection for men, and it also implied that she was celibate, an awkward old maid. I thought it was extraordinary that she felt not only that she needed to deny that she was a lesbian, but to deny she had any sexuality at all, in order to achieve some level of acceptability in a position of power. And I think that's a hell of a lot to ask. Not only are we supposed to give up having children, which was Zoe and Kimba's problem, but we're also supposed to give up sexuality. And I just think we have to really push until the label of lesbian that is used as a cudgel, as an accusation, as something to make women say, oh, no, don't mind me, I really didn't want equality, I'll just go back here in the kitchen. And as long as that label, whether true or not, carries such real risks of losing your job, your credit, your housing, the custody of your own children, your life. And as long as those risks are there, there is going to be there are going to be a lot of women who will not step forward and claim their own rights or speak up on behalf of our movement. It's just the reality. And so from a very pragmatic, political position, there's no question in my mind that lesbian and gay civil rights, LGBT civil rights, are a part of the feminist agenda, just from a pragmatic point of view. I also think that it's a principled position. We support LGBT issues for the same reason that we support ending racism or bias based on ethnicity, because you should not be discriminated against because of an accident of birth. We support the lesbian and gay civil rights issues for the same reason that we support non-discrimination based on religion. Because if it's something that you choose, and most of us, although we are often born into a particular faith, choose our religion as adults, if it's something you choose, you shouldn't face that kind of discrimination. We support lesbian and gay civil rights for the same reason we support abortion rights. In those very intimate areas of our life, whether it's sexuality or reproduction, we don't think that we should have that kind of interference in our privacy, in our sexuality, in our reproductive questions. And also, again, in a pragmatic way, we know that the harassment, whether it's racial harassment, sexual harassment, harassment of LGBT people, has it's a common tactic. It works because it has an underlying threat of violence, which is another common tactic, whether it is James Byrd being dragged to his death recently, or Billy Jack Gaither, or Matthew Shepard, or the woman that I just read about who on her second anniversary was murdered by her husband, who stabbed her 130 times in the breast, in the stomach, in the buttocks, in the vagina, in her eyes. I find those kinds of hate crimes to be a very common tactic used against us in a very effective way. So I see a lot of overlap. I see a lot of principled reasons. I see a lot of pragmatic reasons that we need to stand across the civil rights movement, whether it's for civil rights and equality for women, or for people of color, or for lesbians and gays, people with disabilities. I think we have to look at a broader question as well of people in poverty. I mean, that is a huge population. And if we can get more coherent, more cohesive and coherent. If I could get more coherent and we could be more cohesive, I think we could win, okay? So I think I'm going to just leave that as my opening remarks and pass the baton back to you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker I have known from his youth, and that might appear to be just yesterday. But I remember him as an undergraduate in our college, and as a man then of marked promise and ability. And now that he represents the better part of Cambridge in the Great and General Court, and therefore in some sense bears the responsibility for protecting the ancient liberties of the university before a rapacious legislature, I have great joy in introducing an old friend and a new legislator, the Honorable Jarrett Barrios.
Okay, rather than doing the sort of the convoluted sort of acrobats that she successfully executed, I'm not nearly as coordinated, so I'm just going to stand right here. Can folks hear in the back? Is that okay? Excellent. My name is Jared Tomas Barrios. I am the state representative for, actually not this school, but starting about 50 feet that way, over to MIT. I have about 40% of Cambridge, and that includes 4 of the undergraduate houses. It also includes Dunster, Mather, Adams, and Leverett. It also includes the law school, so if you have any law students here, I hope you're registered to vote. And if not, we can make arrangements in the back afterwards. I ran to become a state representative. Well, I'll tell you why. I was up there one day lobbying, and I noticed there was a lot of polyester. And I'm not talking the new polyester, the thin, I'm talking from the 70s. There were some bad old suits. The legislature needs better dressers.
Absolutely.
The women seem to have figured it out. The guys, on the other hand, it's part of, I think, goes part and parcel of being the old boys' school, the old boys' polyester school. I have the privilege of being the first openly gay man ever elected in Massachusetts to the legislature. I'm one of 3 incoming Latino representatives, hence we could form a caucus. And so I was actually quite honored and intrigued when presented with the opportunity to come chat with you today. And I'm hoping that I'm going to keep my comments brief because I'm really looking forward to the interchange. Because the subject of, especially when it was presented, I think the title, let's see, was Civil Rights and Gay Rights, a Common Struggle. For me, gay rights are civil rights, and for me, civil rights are gay rights, and it has always been the same thing. And that probably is one of the things I'd like to talk about today, and where Peter and I will have a nice back and forth about. But what I guess my point in that is, when you talk about what we conceive of as a civil right, the right to fair housing, the right to go to your job and not be discriminated against, not lose your job because of something not to do with your merit. Or when we talk about the right to engage in civil marriage, the right to engage in civil marriage is a civil right. What a gay or lesbian or bisexual person would want, I think, in any setting, is a right, marriage, job, protection from job discrimination, that anybody else has. Hence, in my mind, it's a civil right. It is not something which we can divorce. And perhaps I'm being a lawyer here. But to me, they are both legally indistinguishable, but also morally indistinguishable. That is the part within us that motivates us to be imaginative or indignant about these issues and how we can overcome them. It is clear from that part of you which wants to change the world that discrimination, whether you're gay or whether you're Latino, at least from my perspective, is one and the same. Now, having said that, and having been active in the gay civil rights movement in Greater Boston, it's left me with a couple of observations, and I'd sort of be interested in, when we get to the Q&A part, your thoughts on these. I've been involved in political organizations that were movement groups. We were going to change the world in the way they perceived us. And in these organizations, one of them was, let's see, I was involved in a group called the Greater Boston Lesbian Gay Political Alliance. And we had our issues that we were going to push at all costs. Part of that was in a very enlightened view on coalition building with racial and ethnic minorities. And that was part of, for example, and also women's organizations. One of our issues was choice. We were a gay and lesbian group, but choice was the issue. Now, was one of our big issues. So for us, in pushing that agenda, we found, I found that it was a lot of times we were more interested in having the dialogue about who we are, what we are doing, than in actually pushing legislation. This is a problem that many groups face. I think an example at the national level would be National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Some of my dear friends work at NGLTF, and they do a wonderful job at being inclusive, at reaching out. However, some would argue that they spend time reaching out at the expense of having an effective legislative agenda, the civil rights that we feel we should have access to. Now, on the other hand, we have a group, and I'll use the example of Human Rights Campaign, a wonderfully effective legislative organization for the gay agenda, or if you agree with me, the civil rights agenda as it impacts gay people. Human Rights Campaign, in 1994, there was a big ballot initiative in California. It was called Prop 187, which actually passed and succeeded in effectively disenfranchising a lot of undocumented folks, or people who maybe had brown skin and appeared undocumented. It was a very anti-Latino ballot initiative, actually anti-immigrant ballot initiative. HRC was asked to endorse Prop 187. They passed on the opportunity because it didn't deal with the gay and lesbian civil rights agenda. Now, I'm not here to castigate NGLTF or HRC, but to recognize that there are two approaches when we talk about our civil rights and how we want to advance that agenda. And I think there's a tension between the two. And I think one of the things I'd like to hear are people's thoughts on where we should go to resolve that tension. There's another tension, though, and I think that, not to criticize Washington, Ms. Ireland, but please. I think a number of the organizations in Washington and out in the hinterlands like Boston, where we have groups focused on the civil rights agenda, forget that there is a civil rights debate, yes, but also what I sort of consider to be a civil community debate. That is, there are organizations like PFLAG who are not political organizations per se. That is to say, it isn't their first goal to pass a piece of legislation, but rather to change attitudes, to change the community that we live in, to promote a civil community in which gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender people are a part of. I would include groups like the Metropolitan Community Churches and Dignity, which is the Catholic organization for gay and lesbian folks. These are groups which are working to advance not an overtly political agenda, but an agenda which, as a byproduct, creates a community which we will be, in which we will be fully franchised. But this is also a tension because, you see, we have limited resources. I as a legislator, you as an activist, you as an avid reader of the newspapers and a voter, you have a certain amount that you can devote yourself to. I have a certain amount of energy. Organizations like NOW have a certain amount of time, and there are important choices to make. So do we spend the time to, HRC recently joined, I guess, LCCR, not the Log Cabin Club Republicans, but the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Sorry, Peter. Which is an umbrella civil rights organization. By doing that, HRC put some of their capital, some of what they had to offer, on the table for the bridge building to other organizations. Obviously, and one thing I haven't mentioned is, it is also the obligation of other organizations, of groups like the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund and La Raza, to also take up the challenge of working with gay and lesbian organizations on the common issues we have. And where they are civil rights issues, to my mind, they are common issues and should be supported, if not in the lead, in support. Through endorsement. These are the kind of issues which, broadly, I think is a tension the movement faces. I would also just want to add, and I actually want to be brief, I'm going to end after this so we can get to the Q&A part. You as an individual can have, not as a member of an organization, but as an individual, as a voter, can have a tremendous impact when you call, perhaps not at the federal level as much, but when you call your legislator or write him or her a letter, and we have now, I think Patricia will be happy to know that we are now up to over 25% in our House of Representatives in women, which is, I think, one of the highest in the country, or getting close to highest in the country. As an individual, we have organizations. HRC endorses D'Amato. We're all angry about that. We write letters to HRC. Well, you could also spend time as an individual writing your legislators about the DOMA bill that's coming before our House of Representatives, which is going to have a hearing on May 18th. I tell you that because one thing I have found which is startling to me is we often neglect some of the most important ways that we can have an impact as individuals who believe ourselves to be part of the gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender civil rights movement. Writing your legislator, calling and asking for a response. These sorts of things, which may seem little to you, not worth getting around, but you'll go to a meeting and sit for 2 hours and debate whether or not we should take a position on X, but people will not write letters. I can tell you, I, as the openly gay representative of a district I've identified at least 600 voters who are gay in my district through my door knocking. I have not received one call or one letter about DOMA yet from my district. If I'm not getting calls, I can imagine what the other legislators in the real hinterlands, Bill Ricca and Norwood and the smaller towns outside of Route 128 are hearing. So as part of this, I always like to use the bully pulpit or soapbox to just encourage you, as we talk about a civil rights agenda, as we talk about a civil rights movement, who's a part of it, what you should be doing, the groups should be doing. Also remember that as an individual, we all have agency. We all have a role that we can play that is really one of the most important roles, especially at the state level. If you have a pen, I'd like you to take it out right now because you are all Massachusetts residents, and write down the following phone number. This is the phone number where you can call your legislator, 722-2000. It's a basic number. Whether you're registered to vote here or not, please take the time, please call. The DOMA bill is being heard on May 18th. That's the Defense of Marriage Act bill. That would be equivalent to what the federal government passed a couple years ago, and what about 30 other states have now passed. These calls will have an impact on the outcome of that debate. This is a civil rights issue. I hope that you will take the time to exercise your civil rights in that regard. That's all I'm going to say. Thanks.
Now, before we throw this open, I think one of the reasons that I was invited to take part in this panel is to provide some comparative perspective on the topic itself, gay rights and civil rights. And I do so briefly, but pointedly, given the difficulties in incorporating and defining the civil rights mandate to include the issues of gay rights that we have addressed tonight. I first came into sort of conflict with the notion between gay rights and civil rights at the time of the gays in the military business, immediately after the election and the beginning of the promise of Mr. Clinton. Civil rights, up to that time, as any of you who have watched that great documentary, Eyes and the Prize, civil rights is almost universally associated with the rights and the struggle for the rights of African Americans in the United States. It's almost a copywritten term. Civil rights means fighting for black civil liberties in the United States in the period from the Civil War onward and ongoing. But the glory days thereof, of course, are the days of the movement of Martin Luther King and the signing of the civil rights bills by Lyndon Johnson and the turning of the world upside down in terms of the African American cultural experience. We all know that. We have been brought up on that. It goes without saying. What also went without saying, alas, was the notion that concept was particularly and exclusively limited to matters of race and matters of the African American experience and the struggle. And so when I tried in the days of the gays in the military, initial days of that controversy, to try to promulgate the parity and the equity question between gays in the military and the integration of the armed services by President Truman at the end of the Second World War, a great howl of protest was raised, frankly, on the part of African Americans who felt that their copyright on the struggle was somehow being infringed, and that there somehow was a moral distinction to be made between civil rights, capital C, capital R, and whatever it was that gay people seemed seemed to feel the country owed them. And this revealed a tremendous fissure in our moral and our legal universe in this country, part of the divisioning which Patricia Ireland spoke of before, by which no rights get accorded to everybody, because everybody with a few rights defends his or her territory absolutely, and feels that the sharing of rights in some respects makes vulnerable the rights heretofore won, and compromises the integrity of the enterprise. And so it was, of course, an ingenious stratagem to have at the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff an African-American in the person of General Powell, who was very much opposed on the basis of advice given to him to gays in the military. And the moral equivalency that was argued, that this too is a civil right, that this too requires a certain amount of moral imagination and civic courage, that particular argument fell to the claim, which is still very much among us today, that somehow the civil rights for which King and Co. fought, and which we grudgingly acknowledged over the last 25 years, those civil rights somehow do not apply to the newest claimants for civic polity in the country. And I think in part that perception inhibits the agenda, inhibits the moral consciousness that's around us, and needs to be acknowledged in some very serious way if we are to go beyond the claim that gay rights are special rights and are simply attempts to add on to the legitimate heroic struggles of persons of color in this country. Either, in my view, either everybody is entitled to all of the civil liberties, or none of the enterprise is legitimate until they do. But that is not a particularly well received view, and in the name of fragile ethnic and cultural unity, very few people will speak out on either side of that particular issue. But this is a very enlightened community, the Kennedy School of Government. You are people of goodwill and some degree of sagacity. Speakers are fluent and able and nimble, and so it seemed to me that was a perfectly legitimate sort of difficult issue to throw into the mix tonight. And so having said that, I hope that given what Patricia Ireland and Jarrett Barrios have offered, we will now be able to enter into a period of lively and informed and directed questions, and that you will, of course, in good order, direct your questions to me, and I will see that they are given to the right person. And so I think now we're ready to hear from you, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. and Mrs. United States, and all the ships at sea. So is there a question, or perhaps more comprehensively, is there an observation that someone wishes to make? And clearly there is. Sir.
I have a question. This actually is for Ms. Ireland. Jarrett sort of touched on the issue of abortion and how it kind of plays with the gay rights movement. And I'm a member of the Mass Gay and Lesbian Democrats, and we had a number of fights over people who are anti-choice but who would vote against the Defense of Marriage Act and be supportive of other gay and lesbian issues. And I wonder where you see the two intersecting, if you can be anti-choice and pro-gay and be a good elected official.
Well, it's obviously a dilemma for a number of organizations. Being a feminist, I don't see how you separate out the politics of sexuality or the political aspect of sexuality any more than you can separate it out from the rest of your life. I mean, it's to me intimately intertwined with all of these other issues. And I think, of course, of Schumer and D'Amato and the race there being one of the prime examples where that, push came to shove. And I have to look at the practical side of it. Someone who is anti-abortion rights, who is going to be in a position, for instance, in the Senate to confirm or not confirm Supreme Court justices, and it appears in the next election cycle, the next president will probably get to name 4 justices by virtue of their age and health. That's what the betting is in Washington. I have to assume that the right to privacy, the right to non-interference in those most intimate areas of our personal lives, whether it's our reproductive lives or our sexuality, are quite intertwined. And I know that there's some candidates who are going to be pro-gay and you know, or say they are, and anti-abortion rights. For my money, we've got to find better candidates. And I know that sometimes, you know, people will make what they consider pragmatic decisions. I disagree rather vigorously with HRC's endorsement for any number of reasons. I don't think that politics is a science. I think it's an art. And to have set out some criteria that then meant they had to endorse D'Amato because they gave him an edge because he was an incumbent, seemed to me to be somewhat, you know, really stretching to be bipartisan. We're bipartisan. I know one elected official who's Republican who agrees with all of our issues. And she's in Pennsylvania. Her name is Barbara Hafer. Now she'll probably never get elected again. But I'm not in, you know, I'm not in an abortion rights group. I'm not in a domestic violence group. I'm in a feminist organization because I don't see how to separate those issues out in our politics any more than in our lives, and I'm really kind of hard-edged about that stuff.
Question on this side?
Yes, this question is actually for Reverend Gomes. This is you in the introduction, it was said that you're a man who defies all stereotypes, and I frankly am interested how you can reconcile being a Republican and a Baptist and also gay.
Well, I've written a book on that subject. I choose to buy it and read it. But I'll honor the question. I assume it's asked in genuine ignorance, and so I'll answer it. I'm a Baptist because that's the religious tradition in which not only I was brought up, but by which I make most sense of the imponderables between this life and the next. Someone asked me if I was a Baptist by immersion, and I said, well, yes, but I'm also a Baptist by inertia in some respects. That one needs a steady place with which to view the chaos of the world, and that's the steady place into which my faith has brought me, and where I stand. I was a Republican, born into the Republican Party at the time when most of the present leadership were still running about in sheets, and so I'm not prepared to cede my commitment to the party of Lincoln and my Massachusetts Republican principles for the present aberration, and I'm not prepared to be driven out by that lot, even though most of my great Republican heroes are dead and have been dead for some time. But I do believe in limited government. I do believe in sound money. I do believe in a reasonable international citizenship, and I believe that the rights that were fought for and won for me by my ancestors and by partisans, particularly in the Republican Party, are rights still worth maintaining. And so, you know, there I am. I don't vote the blind party ticket, never have. My father always told me that in Massachusetts, of course, one should always vote the straight Republican ticket, but in national elections one should be more discerning. Of course, that was 50 years ago, and the Republican Party consisted of people like like Leverett Saltonstall and Bob Bradford and Ed Brooke. And so that was a perfectly legitimate exercise there. Being gay is not a political or a theological or a social or a religious choice for me. It happens to be what I am, who I am, and I therefore find it unnecessary really to reconcile that with anything. I mean, if it's a problem, it's certainly a problem for somebody else. Not really one for me. But the notion of reconciliation, sort of a kind of a squaring of all of the oddities, I think is a conceit. I want to say it's a sort of a cultural conceit. I think only in Philosophy 101 and perhaps maybe in corners of the Kennedy School does one feel that all of these oddities need to be reconciled. We are very complex people, all of us. And by the nature of our experiences, our affinities, our qualities, and our view of the world, we take on what to many people might well be considered sort of inconsistencies and paradoxical allegiances or relationships. But I think that's what makes us interesting. I think that's what makes me interesting, at least. I wouldn't be here if I were pretty dull and predictable. So these sort of odd and awkward parts sort of go with the package. Remember, it was our fellow college man, Emerson, who warned us that a foolish consistency was the hobgoblin of little minds. And the mind may not be a particularly tidy mind, but it is not a little mind. And so I can sort of cope with those things, and I hope that you and others might be able to cope with them as well. Now, another question over here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you. Well, thanks to your open acknowledgement, I'm willing to out myself as a lawyer tonight, too. So I have sort of a legal question for you. You make very cogent arguments about why the Civil Rights Initiative really is an all-inclusive, should be an all-inclusive initiative. However, for better or worse, our laws make very strong distinctions between discrimination based on race, sex, sexual orientation. And in the last couple of years, we've seen both the Supreme Court and state initiatives like propositions really making sort of strong inroads so that groups are really having to rethink and retrench. And it seems like it's a time that would, in a sense, create more division and be very divisive between groups rather than a time when groups really are going to be willing to stand up and fight for each other. And I was wondering if any of you would speak to that.
You want to try that one?
I can try that one.
Bat it out.
So by example, just I want to make sure I understand the tension that you're talking about. You say that, for example, all the propositions that are going on the ballot in California, some target immigrants, there's going to be one targeting gay people, there's an anti-marriage one on the ballot, and there's a sort of divide and conquer,
Right.
sort of what Ms. Ireland was referencing earlier,
Says,
divide and conquer mentality.
Right. Traditional civil rights is really, if it's about African Americans or race in general, groups that are trying to defend that aren't going to be willing, if they're just trying to keep what they have, they're not going to be willing to step up to the plate and say, wait a second, we don't like defensive marriage. We're out there saying women should have the exact same level of protection that African Americans would. Or
Right. I would say, I think one of the things that sadly gets us into the dilemma where we are worried about how to position ourselves in these propositions, whether it's a proposition in California or a ballot initiative here, these are, for our issues, whether it's feminist issues, whether it's gay and lesbian civil rights issues, or whatever it is on the left, these ballot issues represents defensive posturings. So in other words, we are on the defense. And so at the same time, in these organizations individually, now HRC, we also have our proactive agenda. HRC has its legislative agenda, now has its legislative agenda. wants to, these organizations want to pass those efforts, and so there's always a sense, well, do I, by devoting resources to somebody else's defense, am I stopping my ability to effectively garner the support that I need for this? And whether that's garner public support by devoting sort of financial resources, or whether it's political capital, because I'm going to alienate the pro-choice Catholic guy who goes ballistic when he hears the word homosexual. This is sort of the tension. This is politics. And I think that it is, in part, particularly, this is why these propositions have a real negative impact on the progressive agenda. And why, ironically, because in California, I'm no expert of California politics, but when the propositions were instituted, whatever was it, 20 or 30 years ago, it was thought to be a progressive political reform by making it easier to bring these issues to the ballot. And it's really come back to bite us on the butt, I think. You know, I just don't like the idea of having to spend $20 million to defeat a ballot initiative when we could be spending, and first of all, raising that's hard. I mean, there's a whole set of issues that go along with it. And I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, but I'm answering indirectly, because that is the tension that's at play. Because organizations who spend their time raising their money raise it to be proactive, not to defend, and it becomes very difficult, I think, to you're in a difficult position where you have to have something to show for yourself, for your organization, when you have to sort of devote those resources. And I'll admit, I'm answering your question from a very sort of pragmatic point of view. That is sort of the sphere of politics. I think there's probably another answer to your question, which would focus more on, I guess, what I talked about from the community perspective. I think there is an obligation as shared members of a civil community to take the moral stands. And I think that's easier for elected officials like me to do, harder for organizations to do because of where their fundraising commitments are and where some of their political commitments are to other political individuals, elected officials or what have you.
I'd love to jump in here if you can stand two of us on one question, because I think that you build movements based on idealism, not on cynicism, and I think you build movements based on hope. I don't think we've begun to tap the fundraising potential that's out there if we could expand and hold forth with a clear vision of the morality, the practicality of standing together. I do think that we have to respect the different roles that different organizations play. I think that changing public opinion and changing culture and creating a civil community is a precursor to changing the public policy. I don't think you can have public policy or laws that are all that much ahead of the public opinion. You can only call the troops out to enforce a Brown versus Board of Education on rare occasions, and otherwise, you know, ultimately law is voluntary. If I don't pay my taxes, they can get me and get my assets, but if nobody in the country paid their taxes, if we didn't really agree that that was a necessary evil, you know, it wouldn't stick. But I think that on a proof is in the pudding kind of basis, when the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which I find to be a hopelessly compromised, almost beyond the point of principle. It started out as a civil rights bill. It ended up as an employment discrimination bill. It started out as a complete coverage in employment. It ended up with a huge loophole for the Catholic Church and for other religious denominations. But when that vote was taken in the Senate, standing there on the floor or in the antechamber was not only labor represented by John Sweeney himself, not some lobbyist, but also the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. At that time it was Ralph Neese, and now it's Wade Henderson, former NAACP guy in Washington, and the National Council of Negro Women in the person of Dorothy Height. Who else was there? A whole crew of people have made a decision that they're going to not succumb to that siren song, and I think it is a siren song. I think that if we had purged every lesbian out of NOW's leadership, out of the organization, if we'd pushed every lesbian back in the closet, the National Manufacturers Association and the insurance industry would not have supported the Equal Rights Amendment. It would not have meant that President Bush would have signed the Family and Medical Leave Act if we had stopped pushing for poor women and young women's right to abortion. I mean, it's a fantasy that people put out there, or that, you know, well, if you just stop trying to do these controversial things, you could get the more mainstream things passed. Well, those mainstream things started out as very controversial. Women's right to vote was deemed ridiculous, absurd. The women were called mannish, spinsters, unnatural, which was, I guess, as close as they could get to saying lesbian in those days, or sapphic, as the then current term was. But, I mean, those were radical notions in their time, and I think that the mostly, even Reverend Joseph Lowery of SCLC, which I consider a fairly conservative part of the civil rights movement, he was on board the 30th anniversary march for to commemorate the great Civil Rights March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and he included lesbian and gay civil rights in the agenda, had no problem with it. He said to me that when you get to bisexual and transgender, you've gone too far for Reverend Joseph Lowery, but, you know, it's a start. So I just think it's that, I think on a pragmatic level, people are moving in a direction that I think is the right direction.
Is there a question here? Yes, sir.
Yes, there is. Hi, my name is Kurt Rogers. I'm an MPA student here at the Kennedy School. I'm a gay
constituent.
Yeah. I'm a gay man. I'm the executive director of the Gay Men's Domestic Violence Project. I'm a survivor of domestic violence who was turned away from critical services at a time of crisis because the area domestic violence programs would not take a man or a gay man into their program. I find as I try to work to change discriminatory funding to be more inclusive, many of the people that I run it up against are people who claim their position is based on a feminist grounding. Recently, when the VAWA II legislation was being drawn up, it was being drawn up at NOW, and when we called to ask if they would possibly, for those of you who don't know, VAWA stands for the Violence Against Women Act, and it is basically, although its headline would tell you that it's legislation towards all violence against women, it's the dominant funding source, federal funding source for domestic violence programs in this country. So when we called to ask if they would consider making this legislation more inclusive so that gay male victims of domestic violence might find services in places that receive this funding, we were told no. So how does someone like myself, who would like to work in a collaboratory framework, approach an organization like NOW or other feminist-based organizations and persuade them that the real way to go might be an inclusive approach?
And this has your name on it.
Yes, it does. I thought you would take this one. Well, I'm troubled to hear that you raised that issue and that it was dismissed. Because I think, in part, one of the things we have to recognize is there are feminisms. There is not a monolith that is the feminist movement. And in fact, you know, I've been getting a lot of media inquiries about one of our chapters in Virginia who thought that President Clinton should be diced and sliced and, you know, thrown out of office, overturn the election. And I kept telling the press, you know, the real news would be if we all agreed. I mean, you know, the feminist movement has never had one consistent position. We fight over pornography versus free speech. We fight over, you know, a million different things. I would urge that we do work. You know, the Violence Against Women Act is being reauthorized, and there is a Violence Against Women Act 2, VAWA 2, that's like daughter of VAWA, that is designed also to really do a lot for workplace violence, and is also got a fair number of prevention programs. And I think that we should talk through how to work that, because I think that, for one thing, that part of the thing that I think holds back policymakers is that historically the lesbian and gay community has not owned that issue of domestic violence. It's only fairly recently that people are coming out about that because of the concern that, you know, if we're trying to move the movement, we should not acknowledge that there's anything wrong with any lesbian or gay relationship. You know, it's just, it's kind of scary. But I would love to talk with you about that. I'm very troubled to hear that that was the response. I don't think that was the right response in any case.
I want to actually add some.
Yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
Actually, I just want to add one thing, which is, Kurt, the tension, I think, the tension that Patricia mentions is one of, I mean, as when I was trying to describe some of the, in my opening comments about how you have missions at, missions not so much in conflict, but, for example, I'm sure the Violence Against Women Act, the funding that was requested, that debate was something that a lot of people were at the table about. It was a compromised document, and to have, I think there was probably a lot of, there was probably a sense, and I wasn't in that room, but there was probably a sense that this might do something to jeopardize that. And all these folks have worked really hard, and it's not to, in any way, be dismissive of their claim to say, let's open it up to somebody else. But rather, I guess I just like to, I'm somebody who likes to sort of recognize the tension. Let's deal with it, let's work with it at that level. Is what we're talking about that they don't want to let gay men in, or they're afraid that by doing that they might jeopardize everything they've worked for? I think it's probably the latter.
I hear that, but it seems like the whole a big part of the thrust at the beginning of this meeting was that that's a danger. If you start to say that it's okay to sacrifice this one group for the other group, that's what's going to lead to the divisiveness of the different factions, and that how do you actually try to reach across and build stronger bonds so that one group isn't left out because it might weaken the whole?
Well, of course, this is complicated as well by the reality that even among those of us who are not separatists, there is the whole argument that women who have faced violence in their own home from men who at one time said they loved them are very troubled to find a man in their environment. I'm not sure that's so, but it certainly has been an article of some feminists' faith that men could not be served in the battered women's shelters. You know, and I get into these fights all the time. Mary Daly just excluded men from one of her classes, and of course I'm not about to take on Mary Daly, but you know, I think that those are problematic decisions. I don't like the politics of it.
One of the things we perhaps should remind ourselves, though it may be in the spirit of unity unfashionable to do so, is that the civil rights movement is by definition a fractious and fractured movement. It only appears to be unified in face of the implacable oppositions to it. But when you look at it, even in the now idealized days of the black civil rights movement, those divisions between the people that felt Dr. King was moving too fast and people who felt he was moving too slow, Malcolm X, A. Philip Randolph, the whole triumphant march in Washington in 1963 was a compromised, patched together, last-minute enterprise, which it was a miracle, an act of God, that it got through the day, because there were all of these self-interested and self-conflicting sets of interests that were labeled the civil rights movement. Now, looking back on it, it seems that it was a rational, single-engine, well-thought-out, well-driven enterprise. But anybody who reads anything knows that it was a miracle that anything happened. And the broader that the civil rights coalitions become, the more likely those implacable differences rise to the fore. Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm going to hold you to that, because I'm going to. You come back in a minute.
All right.
Sir.
I'm a student from China, and I was saved by the Lord in the stage several years ago. And I want to give a comment and a question. The comment is when I received the program, the brochure, and I found the title of today's event, Gay Rights and Civil Rights, A Common Struggle. I found the title is very misleading because it confused with the right and the wrong. I respect Martin Luther King very much, and but I think civil rights is very different from gay rights. And in Chinese, the title reminded me about Chinese idiom. It said, 鱼目混珠, 混淆是非, means you people pass off fish eyes as pearls, or confuse the right and the right things. And that's why I want to give this comment, because we know that in the Bible, the homosexuality is a notorious sin. Okay, that's the part I want to comment. My question is for the three. Whether, for example, if some drug addicts want to get the right to take drugs, how will you respond? Whether they have the right to take drugs, or whether whether this is good for them. Okay, thank you.
Who has the right to take drugs? Or is that a question we respond to?
Apparently. I think it's a question by analogy, and the analogy is drugs to gay rights. Is anyone prepared to take that on?
I didn't inhale.
I think we'll move on. Sir?
Yes. On the marriage issue, both locally and nationally, I assume that all three of you believe that the right to marry is a civil right. So I would, and I may be wrong on that, but I wondered if the three of you could comment, from Jared from the legislative, Peter from the religious, and Patricia from the feminist perspective on your sort of predictions, strategies, outcomes. And I would be particularly interested in, Reverend Gomes, your sense of this interplay between religion and the secular, because that to me seems to be playing out, particularly in the Methodist Church at this point.
Well, this may be a way to accommodate the concerns of the previous question, as well as addressing this particular concern. Do you want to start on that?
Sure. Well, I'll let you address the concerns of the previous question, and I will talk about the legislative issue. And the key issue with marriage is what Patricia mentioned earlier, how far public policy can't get too far ahead of public attitudes. And I think the key determinant is going to be how much we who believe that this is a civil right, as I do, are able to, how much we are able to persuade our our civil-minded but non-believing neighbors that we should be part of, we should have the same rights they have, that they share. And I should also say, when we talk about marriage as a civil right, I think it's important to recognize there are about, somebody told me, over 170 different rights that go along with the status of being legally married. And they deal with inheritance, they deal with access to pensions, tax benefits. Without getting into too much of the minutiae, it's important to just recognize it's a whole bundle of rights which society conveys to individuals who can get married. Now, what are the predictions locally? What are the predictions nationally? Well, legislatively, what I can tell you is there's a case in Vermont which may find that gay and lesbian individuals have the right to get married. The impact that will likely have in Massachusetts is not clear, but I do think that it will raise the stakes for the DOMA bill that is being debated. I'm not expecting, I actually don't know when the opinion of Vermont's coming down, but it's my hope to have the DOMA bill well on its way to study committee by then. But the consensus I've heard is that perhaps all bets would be off as to that bill being in study if the Vermont bill passes. I don't think that we have the votes right now to stop a piece of DOMA legislation in the Mass House of Representatives should the Vermont case find that Vermonters can get married who are gay and lesbian. And then just one last thing, sort of on a related note, talked about DOMA legislation. I don't mean in any way to concede the fact that if a DOMA piece of legislation, this Defense of Marriage Act legislation, were to pass, that it would be a constitutional piece of legislation. I think there's still an open question as to the constitutionality both of the federal and the state DOMAs. There's this thing called the full faith and credit clause in the Constitution, which some of us believe means something, and that would hopefully invalidate that.
I think it's important to remember that there are two not necessarily complementary arenas in which the question of marriage is debated. The civil arena, which historically in this country has been the primary basis for determining rights to wed. A marriage in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and in most of the Republic is a civil right, not an ecclesiastical enterprise. And officers of religion, rabbis, priests, and ministers, and others who are authorized to solemnize marriage do so as agents not of their churches, but of the state. It's an important distinction to realize. I cannot marry anybody, nor can anybody else in a ministry without a document from the Secretary of the Commonwealth authorizing that. And so it is important to realize that marriage, virtually from the landing of the Pilgrims, has been regarded as one of the civil functions of the state. And therefore is subject not to ethereal, metaphysical discussions about the nature of marriage, but to the state's sensibilities of its own interests and the rights it wishes to guarantee and assert. I say that simply to say that it seems to me that the lobbying, the debate, the raising of a consciousness about marriage in many respects needs to be separated as a civil activity from whatever religious presuppositions or assumptions that the various religious communities may bring to the table. That is important, but they are not one and the same. Now, as to the question of marriage within the various religious communities, we have seen with increasing agitation within the mainstream of the main street American denominations like the Methodists, that the notion of blessing same-sex ceremonies, which are not substitutes for marriage and have purposely been distinguished from marriage, even that raises sort of cultural hackles, not so much on theological grounds, and most people would be hard-pressed to make a serious theological case in this matter. But the fact of the matter is that the religious sensibilities, by and large, provide a kind of moral or social cover, if you will, for one's social sensibilities in these circumstances. And it doesn't surprise me that within mainstream and not so mainstream religious denominations, resistance to this as a civil right increases, along with the sort of built-in religious phobias or anxieties about sexuality in general and homosexuality in particular. So in a strange sort of way, I think it's going to be very much as it was in the civil rights movement, that it's going to be the secular order that drives the religious order eventually to doing the right thing. If one had waited for the churches of America to lead the civil rights movement, we would all be at the back of the bus. The churches will take their cue from the culture, and for better or worse, it means that the culture has to have this debate. And as a Christian minister, it scandalizes me and embarrasses me to say that, as in so many movements for the liberation of the spirit, the religious communities, by and large, will be on the sidelines waiting to see how it turns out. I'm sorry to say that, but I believe that is the case.
Interesting. Well, in terms of predictions, it's very clear that the issue of marriage is a hot button issue. It's one of those wedge issues that is being used and will continue to be used to try to separate the good guys from the bad guys. Depending on who you are, you see different sides being in those categories, but it's clearly an election issue. It's clearly a political issue. From a feminist point of view, of course, I started out with the question of why in the world would anyone want to get married? Because when I went to law school, the first things I learned were the English common law maxims like husband and wife are one and that one is the husband. And that's why you took your husband's name, because it was a civil death for women when we got married. And I practiced law when the head and master laws were still in effect, where a man could mortgage or sell or give away the couple's property without his wife's consent, indeed over her explicit objection. And so, when I read those things, although I've been married now for 30 years, I took off my ring, I took back my family name, and decided that I didn't want the state to be able to impose a certain set of contractual obligations on my relationship that didn't fit us. And so it's taken me quite a while, and I had to hear all of these different, 122 rights or however many advantages there are to legal marriage to get with the program, because I don't find the institution itself has a bad history. Once I got past that, it was a little easier. I think that we have a long road to hoe, and at the other hand, I'm very optimistic at how fast people's opinions can change. We are now up to something like 75 or 80% of the people polled who say there should not be job discrimination based on sexual orientation. I lived through the Dade County ordinance fight in 1976, where the scripture-spouting songbird Anita Bryant put together a campaign called Save Our Children, and argued that lesbians and gays should not be kindergarten workers, child care workers, teachers, police officers, anything with authority where you might come into contact with kids. So now all these years later, what is it? It's only 23 years later, 75 to 80% of the people understand and agree that there shouldn't be job discrimination. Now, even if you take into account who lies to pollsters because they think it's fun or because they think it's the right answer, that's still a huge shift. I think that there'll be an equally huge shift over the issue of marriage as more and more people come to the conclusion, as I did finally, that there are, serious civil advantages beyond, tax breaks and all of the other things that come along. I'm intrigued also, and I did want to respond to the former questioner, because I think that there's a pretty clear distinction, people who are wanting to advocate taking drugs, in that those people, and indeed addicts, basically, unless they've been, in jail for a felony, have their civil rights. And taking drugs is not a civil right historically. Indeed, it's been criminal in most parts of the world, most of our experience. The only way that it starts getting into the area of civil rights is to the extent that we have the Disability Rights Act, and there are now arguments going on through the courts of whether being an addict is a disability covered by that act, which is played out. But the other thing is, what's in the Bible is subject to interpretation. When this country was founded, people looked at the Bible and thought, well, okay, it's okay to have masters and slaves, because in Ephesians it says that slaves should submit to their masters. And indeed, I just talked to someone from, a theologian from the Promise Keepers, who is a Southern Baptist, who said that when push to the wall about it, said that if slaves had been mistreated, of course they should have gotten, into the Underground Railroad and left, but if they were not being mistreated, they had a biblical obligation to stay there. Now, most denominations have moved beyond that. What changed? The Bible didn't change, the interpretation and understanding did. Just as the Mormons suddenly had a revelation that African Americans could move up in their clergy, I think there are still revelations going on. I think we should also remember that homosexuality was not even mentioned in English language Bibles until 1946. I mean, Jesus said nothing about homosexuality. You can't necessarily imply something from silence, but it clearly was not high on the Christian agenda when the Christ was advocating things on earth.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thank you.
We will. I'm getting urgent signals here, and I wonder if I might take one more question from this side.
Could we ask everyone, though, would you mind if we ask everybody to make their comments without us commenting? I'd like to hear kind of, what they had to say.
Well,
would we run out of time?
The answer is no.
Okay,
we
good.
can't do that.
That's why he's the moderator.
But none of us are running off immediately, and if there's a rump that remains after the adjournment, that's perfectly in the spirit of this school. But one more question, and then we'll bring it to a close.
My question is for Representative Barrios. It's just a specific prediction, kind of relates to the last question about the DOMA bill that's before the legislature now. What do you think are the chances that that bill could actually go through committee and pass through the legislature if the vote were taken today, or just in general? What do you think about that bill?
I think it depends. I think that most people haven't made up their mind about it yet in the legislature. And I think when it starts getting press in mid-May, as the hearing date approaches, they will begin making up their mind. It is my hope that the sort of the public opinion, or the way it will get portrayed in the press, is this is a hater's bill. This is the sort of stuff that made it possible for Matthew Shepard to get crucified in Wyoming, that the sort of hatred that comes out around this bill, and that we are able to play up the Christian Coalition's links. This is the same bill which has been introduced by the Christian Coalition in 30 other states, and that we need to play that piece up. If we're not able to do that, in the press, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to sort of peel off a lot of the voters. I had a very interesting meeting with the lobbyist for the Catholic Conference of the Archdiocese of Boston last week about the bill, and he was telling me about how they were going to be making their calls to legislators on the opposite side of this bill, from me, from us, that is in support of DOMA. And I can tell you, they're quite organized, and they will be calling 70% of the legislature is Catholic, 70%. And all of those, including me actually, all of us will get phone calls, although I think he put me in the no column after. It will. I think a big part of the determinant will be, again, the way it is spun publicly, but I think the biggest part is the amount of contact people actually get from their home district is a huge determining factor in these kind of votes. If it's something big like the budget or capital punishment, people will have their minds made up on these issues. Where it's an issue where people, half these folks in the legislature never saw a homo until they met me, or they met Liz Malia, who's the lesbian rep. They haven't thought through sort of their views on a lot of these issues, but they will be impacted by contact from constituents who have made up their mind and are expressing their views. So I say the extent we can get calls made and letters written, and the extent the press gets interested in this issue in a way which spins it our way, is going to have a big impact.
Is it the House and the Senate?
It is in the House now, and then it will go to the Senate after the House.
Thanks.
It is a House bill.
Thanks.
Maybe it's on this rather sobering note that we should conclude the formal proceedings by reminding ourselves, or being reminded, that progressive and progress are not necessarily the same enterprise and don't occur at the same rate. And one of the sad but true observations that anybody is prepared to make who has observed the long tortured history of civil rights in this country from the 17th century onward is that we must never underestimate the opposition to civil rights for people not heretofore included. This is a selfish and conservative world in which we live, conservative with a small c, meaning that there is no natural generosity of spirit and a great deal of anxiety and paranoia of spirit. And so here in this emerald city of ours, it might seem that this is onward and upward and inevitable and excelsior, but in the real world that is not the case, and therefore one cannot ever slumber or sleep or take anything for granted or any alliances as permanently established. Old Stokely Carmichael's great line, not permanent alliances but permanent interests. And if the permanent interest is the moral and social enfranchisement of all citizens, then that is an ongoing, constantly renewing agenda for the Republic. We can take nothing for granted. We can make no assumptions that we have reached or even near the promised land, which ought to give all of us, all of you here particularly, both encouragement and stimulation not to give up or grow weary in well-doing. And on that pious note, I bring these proceedings to a close. Thank you all very much.
Quite pious.
Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want you.
Hi.